What I wanted to start with today is just mention that although we probably don't think of it this way, the story of Noah is actually one of the creation stories in the book of Genesis. And the place where I came to realize how definitely it is considered that by other Christians was when I was standing in the Sistine Chapel. Now, this is National Geographic that I saved from 1989 because it has paintings of the Sistine Chapel in it. But this is when they were doing the restoration and uncovering the beauty of Michelangelo's stuff. And when you look back, let me see if I can find one of the old pictures here. Okay, this is a good view. This is what it looked like before. Just pure black, right? I mean, so much smoke and stuff. And this is the first beginning of the cleaning, and this is what we now see today. So that was what they were doing. But as you stand in the Sistine Chapel and look up, here's the really famous God reaching out to Adam to create man, and then Eve, and then the tree, and the next ones are Noah's Ark. Okay? And unless you actually see that, it doesn't occur to you, oh, this is considered a creation story. Now, this is something else I didn't know till I went there. The dimensions of the Sistine Chapel are a copy of the dimensions of Solomon's temple, and thus it is meant to be a temple. And that brings up all kinds of interesting stuff about the prophets and the sibyls, women. The sibyls are, I'm trying to think of the word, Gentile women who prophesied of Christ, and then the others are the literary prophets. And then we have paintings of the families of the kings of Israel. So the kings and queens and their children. And if you go down the wall below those, it's curtains and veils. It's really an interesting place to stand as a member of the church who's been to the temple. It's quite a sacred place. I stood there and cried. My daughter just went and sat over on the other side of the room and waited while I did that. Another aspect that we sometimes don't think about with the Cain and Abel story is if they're both offering sacrifice, they both hold priesthood. And so this is letting us know that the original plan, the original way that God's people were organized was with all of them priests. Adam and Eve were both clothed in Ketoumet. We've talked about that as priesthood clothing. We know that both Cain and Abel could offer, and therefore both were priests. Last week we talked about a man had two sons. And usually in the Old Testament, it is the oldest son that will receive the birthright and be the priest for the family. Now that will get handed down into Christianity. And if you know any Italians or Irish Catholics, very often their oldest son would join the priesthood because that's the pattern, is that you have a priest for your oldest son. That gets changed at the Exodus, where instead of taking the oldest son of every family and train them to be priests, like Samuel, the young boy, was trained by Eli at the temple. Can you even imagine having all those unaccompanied boys at the temple to try and train them to be priests? Instead, they had one family chosen to hold priesthood, and that would be the Levites. And you'll watch how the firstborn sons have to pay a redemption price, and a Levite replaces them 1-to-1 until they run out of Levites. And then those that aren't covered by the Levites, each of them pays a redemption price to the temple. And even Jesus will be redeemed, because he's the firstborn, from needing to be a priest at the temple. Now, I hope you can see that what's happening is a constriction of who's receiving priesthood. And it's going to get constricted even more because it's not all the Levites, it's only going to be Aaron's family. And after that, it's only going to be one descendant of Aaron whose name is Zadok. That's one of the words on the board here. It's this word, Zadok, righteous. That word gets translated into Greek as Sadducee. And so it goes down just to the Sadducees, and then it essentially disappears, right? I mean, in the church, we know that John will be translated and continue to hold priesthood on the earth. Later we'll get some 3 Nephites, but there's no priesthood for among the people for a long time. And we're at the point where it is now expanding again. And the goal is everybody, get everybody into the temple. And as we do temple work, that's essentially what we're doing, is getting everybody going back to that primordial state of everyone being priests. So I thought we would just look at the text where it talks about the priesthood among the sons of God and the sons of men, and see what happens to it in this story. We don't get the full story, of course, in Genesis, so we have to cheat and go to the book of Moses for some of this. So if you want to turn to chapter 6 of Moses, that's page 15, if you have a hard copy of The Pearl of Great Price. And this is talking about the birth of Adam's and Eve's sons. Now, this is important. This couple will have 3 sons that we know by name. We're sure Adam and Eve had more kids than that. But we get Cain, we get Abel, we get now Seth. And the next story is about Noah, who has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So this is a pattern that Noah is much like Adam. So Adam hearkened to the voice of God and called upon his sons to repent. And Adam knew his wife again. This is after the death of Abel. And she bore a son. His name was Seth, which means appointed in the place of. So he's the replacement kid for Abel. And God revealed himself to Seth, and he rebelled not, but offered an acceptable sacrifice, like unto his brother Abel. And to him was born a son, and his name was Enos, which means human. And then began these men to call upon the name of the Lord, and the Lord blessed them. And a book of remembrance was kept, in which was recorded in the language of Adam, for it was given to as many as called upon God to write by inspiration. This is the first mention of writing that we get, and it is not in Genesis. But there are going to be powerful traditions handed down about the books that Adam wrote, that Enoch wrote, that get handed down to Noah, and the books that he wrote. So in the Pseudepigrapha and in the Apocrypha, you're going to find traditions of books written by the fathers. And since we've been talking about Abraham, who desires to be a greater follower of righteousness, which is Tzedek, which is in Melchizedek, okay, that's the word in priesthood, is righteous. And he talks about the records he obtained from the fathers. Now, there's only 10 chapters of Genesis before Abraham. What is he talking about, all these records? Well, the tradition is that there's a lot of things being written, and that's what Moses 6 restores. And so as many as were called upon God to write by the spirit of inspiration, it was given to them. And by them, their children were taught to read and write. Who's teaching the kids to read and write? Mom and dad. That seems to be a responsibility many people have abdicated and handed off to somebody else. But from the beginning, it was mom and dad who taught the kids how to read and write, having a language which was pure and undefiled. Now, this same priesthood, which was in the beginning, will be at the end of the world also. Wait a minute, what priesthood is it just talking about there? It's talking about that reading and writing is a skill that priests have. And in most of the history of the world, the people who could read and write were temple priests at various religions and various gods that they worshipped. And they kept that knowledge to themselves as much as possible because it gives you power. Our plan is everybody teach their kids, and the kids are going to teach their kids, and everybody's going to know how to read and write. Now, this group will become known as the sons of God, those who hold the priesthood, sons and daughters of God. But you have a contrast with the descendants of Cain in verse 52 of chapter 5 of Moses, just on the other page. It says, they kept not the commandments, and it displeased God, and he ministered not unto them, and their works were abominations, and began to spread among all the sons of men. And so it's talking about a dispersion of knowledge of different kinds among the sons of God and the sons and daughters of God and the sons and daughters of men. Now that's the language that we're going to find in Genesis 6 when we begin to read Genesis 6. It came to pass that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, daughters were born unto them. Now I'm not sure if you noticed how unusual chapter 5 was. It's giving the genealogies. It starts out, this is the book of the generations told out of Adam, the births attributed to Adam and his genealogy on down to the time of Noah. But each individual doesn't just have one son. You're going to see sons and daughters. We're going to lose that later. So in the beginning, there's a focus on sons and daughters. And I think that's where we're getting to again, as it says here, this same priesthood which was in the beginning shall be at the end of the world also. And we're beginning to talk about women and priesthood, which was in the beginning. So it's kind of fun to watch that happen. So, let me see where I go here. Okay. Now, the sons and daughters of God, verse 2 of, is this where I want to go? Yeah. Chapter 6, verse 2. We're now going to start using the words on the board, because what we just read out of Moses, I don't know what the Hebrew was. I'm not sure Joseph ever saw the Hebrew, but we do have the Hebrew for the Genesis portions, and so I give you the Hebrew words. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. Sons of God is B'nai Elohim, literally, sons of God. Daughters of men is Bat Ha'adam. Bat is daughters, Adam is man. Adam is man. It's the generic term. And they saw that they were fair. Now, this is way down here. But fair is the word tov, which in verse 5 is going to be compared with ra, which is wickedness. That's the good and evil of the tree of knowledge. Tov is good, ra is evil. So these two families are going to represent good and evil, both the effects of eating from the tree, good and evil. Let's look at what happens when you have, verse 2. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all they chose. This is men who hold the priesthood, marrying women who are not in the covenant and don't hold the priesthood, non-members, in effect. We see that story in the Book of Mormon, where we have priests who go out and marry who they choose, the daughters of the Lamanites. These are the priests of wicked King Noah. Isn't that interesting? That this discussion happens after we are dealing with Noah? This is not a coincidence. So we have the priests of Noah who gather together. This is in Mosiah chapter 20. We have the death of wicked King Noah in 19. And these wicked priests were ashamed to return because they had abandoned their wives and their kids. Okay? Just ran away from them to protect their own lives. And having tarried in the wilderness, they discovered the daughters of the Lamanites, verse 4, and they laid and watched them. And when there were but a few of them, of the girls gathered together, they, the priests of Noah, came out of their secret places and took them and carried them into the wilderness, 24 of them. This is like the rape of the Sabin women from 7 brides for 7 brothers, right? They're simply taking whoever they want, which is not appropriate for sons of God or priests. First of all, when we get to the book of Ezra, he will underline this and kick out anyone who claims to hold priesthood whose parents were not both Levites and descendants of Aaron. And so a lot of people will lose their position because they don't have the genealogy to back it up. But if you are going to be a priest in the Aaronic priesthood in the Old Testament, you have to marry a daughter of Aaron. Both of you have to have that genealogy. So what happens next is in chapters 23 and 24, where we find the priests of Noah, verse 31 of chapter 23, page 192. They found the priests of King Noah in a place they called Amulon, after the head of the priests. And when the Lamanites come, they bring their wives out to plead on their behalf and ask for mercy from the Lamanites, because the girls have decided, okay, this is who we're married to now, we want to keep them alive. And chapter 24, Amulon did gain favor in the eyes of the king of the Lamanites. Now, that quotes a line from Genesis chapter 6, where Noah found favor in the sight of God. Okay? This is very much a biblical phrase. And he granted that he and his brethren should be appointed teachers over the people, because they know how to read and write, which is a gift, a power that has been lost among the Lamanites. When Nephi and his brothers, the righteous, left and went and built the city of Nephi and built a temple, the Lamanites are cut off from the presence of the Lord. They don't have a temple in their midst, and they're going to forget how to read and write over the generations. They're going to go out hunting and drinking and other stuff, and education is not a big deal. But they realize that the king realizes there's power here. And so he appointed, verse 4, he appointed teachers of the brethren of Amulon in every land, and thus the language of Nephi began to be taught among the people of the Lamanites. And they were a people friendly with one another. They're a great bunch of people. You'd enjoy having for friends, probably, if you're a Lamanite. But they knew not God. Neither did the brethren of Amulon teach them anything concerning the Lord their God, neither the law of Moses. Nor did they bother to tell them about what Abinadi had just said about them. because it's rather negative, right? Well, what is a priest supposed to be doing? He's supposed to be teaching the words of God and the law of Moses to the people, and they just have abdicated that. Instead, verse 6, they taught them that they should keep records, that they might write to one another, and thus the Lamanites began to increase in riches, and began to trade one with another, and waxed great, and began to be a cunning and a wise people as to the wisdom of the world. Yea, a very cunning people, delighting in all manner of wickedness and plunder, except among themselves. Cunning is one of the names for one of the two ways. Remember that we talked about last week? You have the straight and narrow way and the plan of happiness. Oh, the cunning plan of the evil one. They're going to use education. They're going to use words. They're going to use language, but not to teach about God and not to teach about good things. It's to get rich. And we call this priestcraft. That's the term the Book of Mormon will use. Of prostituting your priesthood, your ability to read and write, your knowledge, to just make money out of it. Now, if you go back to the book of Moses, in chapter 8, where it is talking about Noah, we're going to get a very interesting set of verses. Because this story about Amulon and the priests of Noah is sons of God who marry daughters of men, just like in Genesis chapter 6. But in Moses 8, we get a different story. So Moses 8, that's page 26. Noah and his sons hearkened unto the Lord and gave heed, and they were called the sons of God. And when these men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of men saw that those daughters were fair, and they took them wives, even as they chose. You see that this is the same story, but a reversal of the names? This one in Genesis is sons of God taking daughters of men. In Moses 8, it's sons of men taking daughters of God. So this is non-member men marrying member women. And this is what God has to say. And the Lord said to Noah, the daughters of thy sons have sold themselves. That's called prostitution. That's how God sees it when women don't marry a priesthood holder. The knowledge, the things they've been taught are not necessarily going to be passed down to their children for the right reasons and used in the right way. Now, I hope you notice that I use the same word for both the men who prostitute the priesthood and it becomes priestcraft, and the women sell themselves, and that is prostitution. This is where you see the language of whoredom applying to both men and women. It means not keeping the commandments of God, who Jehovah is your husband, and you are then an unfaithful wife, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. Okay? So although the language of the Old Testament will often talk about all the unfaithful people as wives who go whoring after other gods, it's a metaphor, and it includes both the men and the women. So that's where we see this story. That's not what the priesthood was given for. Now, as you continue to read in chapter 6 of Genesis, verse 3 actually probably comes from a different text. We're going to see in the story of Noah that there were two versions of the story. One is written using the name of God. That's the first two verses that we've read. And then one version of the story is going to be written using the name the Lord. We'll see it most vividly in the number of animals taken on the ark. The one told under the name of God, you have male and female, two, just like in Genesis chapter 1, which was told under the name of God, Elohim. You get to 2 through 4, where you see the Lord, and you have a story talking about sacrifices and needing to have more than 2 animals. You got to have 7. A man and his wives is actually what it says of the 7 animals. And you know, that's the language used of Adam and Eve, is a man and his wife, man and woman, ish, isha. Whereas male and female, which is the story told under the name of God, is zachar v'nekeba, which is male and female. It's blatantly using, there's 2 different stories that are going back to 2 different creation stories told about Elohim are from the northern kingdom of Israel. The stories of Jehovah are from the southern kingdom of Judah, where they had a temple, and thus apply the law of Moses and offer sacrifice. But what we find is these have been edited and combined together, and so it's a little confusing. Because is it 2 or is it 7? There's 2 stories. Just relax, they're editing it, okay? But as we go back to, so verse 3 is probably from a different story. Verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, they bore children unto them. And the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Now, this is going to lead to all kinds of interesting pseudepigraphal stories or apocryphal stories about the sons of God being angels who fall to the earth because the word translated as giant, nephal, is the word fallen in Hebrew. It doesn't mean giant. It has nothing to do with being big. But I love it because it's nephal, N-F-L. You want to think of great big, huge football players, okay? Men of renown and mighty men. So let's look at those 3 words. So Nephilim, which gets translated as giants, is actually N-F-L, which means fallen. If you're going to talk about Adam and Eve and the fall, that's the word. These are fallen. And they were sons of God who fell, right? They're going for priestcraft rather than priesthood. And they become mighty men. This is like David and his mighty men. It's actually a military term for your strongest warriors that you put in charge of everybody else and that are your own small core of men who fight with you personally. David and his mighty men. They often, when we get to the Book of Kings, will be conscripted from other countries. What is it called when you have somebody who is paid to fight for you? Mercenaries. Very often these are mercenaries. And they are called Gebarim. Now that's interesting because that GBR is the basis for the name Gabriel, who is a mighty man of God. Well, folks, who's Gabriel? That's the name Noah had in the pre-existence. So we're going to talk about 2 different kinds of mighty men. Those who are mighty but fallen, and Noah, who is mighty and righteous. The other is men of renown. And the word renown is actually translating the word Shem, which is the Hebrew word for name. One of Noah's sons, the most righteous, the birthright son, Shem. So we're going to have this contrast between Shem and Gabriel and the priestcraft on the other side, the fallen ones. Okay? And you kind of miss that if you don't see it in the Hebrew. Okay, so they're making a name for themselves rather than taking upon them the name of God. And do you remember how that was used? I mean, we talked about the tower last week as one of the two temples, right, in the two different cities. And they made a name for themselves instead of going to the temple to get the name of God. So what name are you interested in? Is it fame or is it serving God? So the wickedness of them is, God saw that the wickedness, that's Ra, again, evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The wickedness was great in the earth. And every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, this is kind of a weird little place in Hebrew, but where it says the imagination, that's translating a Hebrew word, yetzer, which is the word used in the creation of Adam. Adam was formed by God. Do you remember how we talked about Adam is formed, Eve is built? But yetzer, in the forming of Adam, is misspelled. And every copy of the Hebrew text passes on that misspelling because you can't change it. And the way it's misspelled is that it is written with two yuds at the start instead of just one. Should be just one. But you have two yuds. And so out of that misspelling, the rabbis said, there are two inclinations in man. One toward good, tov, and the other toward evil. Can you see how this is necessary to have agency? You're created with two inclinations. Sometimes there's an apocryphal story about having an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, right? Tempting you or leading you to do what is right. And the suggestion here is there's not two inclinations anymore. It's only one, and it's only evil. What are the kids going to learn that are born to those who only do evil? You're going to do evil. And we had a friend who that was his experience. I think I probably mentioned him before. His name was Mario Fazioni, and an Italian Catholic who lived in Detroit, and his dad was a member of the mafia. And when Mario was about 9, he joined the mafia and was taught how to steal. And no one would suspect a little 9-year-old kid who's just breaking into houses while people had gone to work. And he was taught where to look for the valuables. That's how he's raised. Is that ever going to change? It did for Mario. It's an amazing story. And you can actually buy his book, the book, written about him, and there's a movie, a DVD about Mario. And he's actually able to convert. Walk away from the raw, the evil, and instead do tov. And the last we knew of Mario, he's actually passed away, but when we last saw him, he was a temple worker at the Detroit temple. Now, we're talking, this is a radical change. And that's available. You don't have to stay one of the sons of men or daughters of men. you can change. You can walk a different path. So, in verse 6, it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Now, that is not the word repent. That is not shuv or teshuvah that we've talked about, turn around and go the other way. This is actually the word naham, which means to sorrow or grieve. God was sorry for what he's watching. And you see that in the story of Enoch, who's at the same time as this, right? Enoch is alive at the same time as Noah. And as Noah, we're going to meet him as he preaches, all of his converts will change cities. They'll move to the city of Enoch. Now, the Old Testament doesn't have anything about Noah preaching. 2 Peter does, that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. And of course, the book of Moses talks about how Noah preaches for 300 years, and that one of the reasons God has him build this ark out in the middle of a plain, not near the ocean, is to get people's attention. So they would come and say, why are you doing this? And once they ask questions, he can then teach them. Now, there are those, because it doesn't talk about his preaching in Genesis 6, there are rabbis who will say, Noah wasn't a very good person. Abraham, when he knew that the city of Sodom and Gomorrah was going to be destroyed, he bargains with God that if there's 50, if there's 40, if there's 30, if there's 20, if there's even 10 righteous, will you not kill them all? And you don't see Noah doing that. But it's not the whole story. And the real story is that Noah probably converted thousands who then moved to the city of Enoch or were taken up over time in the 300 years. And that's what the book of Moses will teach us. So, God is grieving. Sorry, just a second. I forgot to turn off my phone here after I looked up some Hebrew words. There we go. It repented the Lord that he had made man, and it grieved him. Now, Nahum grieved. It grieved that he had created, and the word there, bana, is from Genesis 1, where bara, that's bara, God creates. So this is quoting Genesis 1 about the creation of mankind and Jehovah being sad that he had created man. Verse 7, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and creeping things and fowl of the air. Did you notice that's quoting Genesis 1? But reverse order. Mankind, day 6, part 2. Creeping things and the cattle, the beasts of the land, day 6, part A. And then fowls is on day 5. Now, it's in reverse order of how he created them in Genesis 1, but they're listed in an order from there. It repenteth me, grieves me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the sight of God. Okay. Naham is grieved. Noach, same first two letters, is Noah. So we're getting a play on words here. Noach, Naham. Okay, I hope you can hear that. And then, this is even cooler. Noah found grace, which is chen, which is the two letters of his name in reverse order. And that's grace. Now, there's a whole, 2.5 pages, well, not that much, 2.5 columns about what it means to find grace in God's sight. And that's in Exodus 33 and 34. But the short version is, to find grace in God's sight means that he goes with you. Can you see how that's the promise each time you partake of the sacrament? When you take his name, not make one for yourself, you take his name, you repent, not just grieve, but actually change what you're doing, and you're promised that you'll always have his Spirit to be with you. You have found grace in his sight. Okay? Now it's going to talk about These are the generations, chapter 6, verse 9. These are the generations or the children told out of Noah. And then it doesn't list his sons. Instead, it lists 3 characteristics. That's kind of interesting. Noah was a just man, and he was perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. A just man is the word tzaddik. So whenever you read about someone who is a just man, or justification in the writings of Paul, it's talking about righteousness. And the Hebrew word is tzaddik, which is the second half of melech tzedek, a righteous king. Okay? So I personally think it's saying Noah is a Melchizedek priesthood holder. He is a tzaddik, which is that name Zadok or Sadducee, the name of the people, the tribe, the family that had priesthood at the time of Jesus, the Zadokites. He was perfect, which is tumim, as in Urim vav tumim, Urim and Thummim, which is something the high priest wears. And one of the purposes of God giving you light is so that you can become perfect. Now, perfect, the Hebrew doesn't mean that you can do everything really well. It essentially means whole, and can be translated like integer, whole numbers, or having integrity. And I think integrity is a better word for us, maybe, so that we don't get caught up in perfectionism. Because that is a real burden that many people in the church struggle with. They can't cook as well as so-and-so. They can't sew as well as so-and-so. They can't sing as well as so-and-so. They can't, and especially the women seem to be really down on themselves all the time because they're not perfect. And their body isn't perfect. Well, that's not what the word is about. It's about having integrity, that what you say you will do, you keep your covenant. You keep your promises. You don't say one thing and do another. You are whole. And then the third that it mentioned is that Noah walked with God. That's a phrase that will not be used for everybody, but it's used for someone before Noah, and that's Enoch. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not. That's all that the Old Testament really says about Enoch. And from that comes the whole story of his translation and being taken up. That's not what walking with God necessarily means. It means that of the 2 ways that are out there, the broad way or the straight and narrow path, you're walking in God's ways. Okay? You have chosen his way of life. And that's what Noah has done. And then it names the sons that he has, that he's given birth to: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Others who walk with God: Adam and Eve in the garden, when the Lord comes and walks with them in the evening. Enoch, Abraham: walk thou before me and be thou perfect. Do you see the same words? Okay. Isaac, Eleazar, Abraham's servant, when he goes to get Rebekah, talks about him walking with God. The Lord walks with Israel in the wilderness. He walks as a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. And he pitches his tent among them. Okay? Here is Leviticus 26. These are covenant words. Leviticus 26 is a statement of covenant. I will walk among you. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Okay, so that's the offer. But instead, verse 11, the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Okay. Corrupt is shachat, which means the destroyer, or to blot out, as in blotting out people's names. If you don't take the name of God upon you, you get blotted out of his book of life. But violence is that Hebrew word Hamas. Have you ever heard of Hamas? Yeah, it's the Palestinian terrorist group. That somehow people in the West think they're going to be able to get a treaty of peace between Hamas and Israel. If your name means violence, what are the odds that you're going to agree to peace? Hamas's purpose is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Kill every Jew. It is very difficult to find a happy medium here. So the same story is continuing into our day. Verse 12. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. And when it talks about all flesh had corrupted its way, the rabbis have a really, to me, interesting commentary. They say it is the way of man to produce things and money and become rich. And we've seen how that corruption comes in. We saw that among the priests of Noah in the Book of Mormon, priestcraft. But they say the way of women is childbearing. And they said even the women have become corrupted. And this is quoting from the rabbis. They destroy their own seed, which means, I don't know if you know the term onanism. It's named for one of Judah's sons who refuses to give children to his brother's widow under the laws of levirate marriage. He won't give her any kids. Still has intercourse, but withdraws so that she won't get pregnant. He won't give her any kids. So that's one method. Abortion, contraception, infanticide, sodomy, and bestiality are things that are attributed to the people at the time of the flood by the rabbis, which means corrupting the way of women, not using the intimate relations between husband and wife for the purpose God created them, to bring people together, to show love and affection, to have children. That's all gone. The men are taking any woman they want. Doesn't matter who she belongs to or who she wants to be with. This is totally contrary to God's law. Now, I don't know if you remember, I talked about how each of the chunks of text are divided up into weekly readings, like we have for Come Follow Me in the Hebrew 5 books of Moses. So they spent the entire year reading the 5 books. And the first week, they read about Adam and Eve on down to chapter 5. And then 6 to 10, all about Noah, is the second week. And each week, they also have a reading from the prophets. That's the readings from Torah are the parasha, and the readings from the prophets are called the haftorah. And I was really fascinated to find what the haftorah, what the prophetic reading is for the story of Noah. And this is the one time that I know of that one of the prophets in the Old Testament, one of the literary prophets, refers to the story of Noah. So you can see why they chose this. This is Isaiah chapter 54 to Isaiah 55, verse 5. Now in verse, this is an incredible chapter. It talks about the righteous will inherit the Gentiles. That has an interesting play in the story because Noah is considered to be a Gentile. So was Adam and Enoch. Everybody who lives before Abraham, who they accept as the one who is worshiping the one true God, he becomes a Hebrew, Abraham the Hebrew. And it isn't until you get to his grandson, Israel, Judah, that you get Jews. So these are Gentiles. Now what that means is that when you get to the New Testament and the issue comes up about what are we going to do with this centurion who is a Greek, he's a Gentile, and he wants to join the church. Does he need to be circumcised first? Does he need to become Jewish in order to enter the covenant? And you remember that conference at Jerusalem, where Jesus' brother James is the head of that conference, and they come up with the decision that no, Gentiles do not need to become Jews in order to enter the covenant. But they do need to keep all the commandments that were given to the Gentiles before the law of Moses. And so they go through and are going to take from the story of Noah what commandments Adam and Eve and Noah are given, and those will be incumbent upon Gentile converts. Those are called the Noahic or Noahide laws. So these guys are Gentiles. But it says in verse 3 that your seed is going to inherit the Gentiles. You will no longer be a widow in verse 4. Do you see the metaphor of Jehovah as the husband? And Israel being taken into captivity by Assyria, the lost 10 tribes of Israel, are now a widow. But they won't be widows anymore. This is all going to be restored. Verse 5, for thy maker is thy husband. The Lord of hosts is his name, thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. The God of the whole earth shall he be called. For the Lord hath called thee as a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit, a wife of his youth, when thou wast refused, saith God. For a small moment have I forgotten thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee. Now, I'm going to see in the next verse what he considers that moment, one of the moments when he hid his face, but with everlasting kindness. This is tender mercies, right, of Elder Bednar. Will I have mercy upon thee, saith the Lord, thy Redeemer. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so I have sworn that I will not be wroth with thee anymore. Mountains will depart and hills removed. When water is covering them, you don't see any mountains or hills anymore. But my kindness will not depart from thee, and neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed from thee. O thou who is afflicted, tossed with the tempest, and not comforted. That's Noah's name, comforted. He's on the boat. There's this terrible storm on the water. There's affliction. And I am going to lay a foundation, and of course it's the temple that he's talking about, and describes it using all the stones that are in the breastplate of the high priest. Thy children shall be taught of the Lord. See, you're going to use priesthood the right way. Great shall be the peace of thy children. In righteousness shalt thou be established. But in order to do all of these wonderful things, thou shalt be far from oppression. Thou shalt not fear. Thou shalt be far from terror. It shall not come unto thee. So the rabbis will say, if you want to be considered righteous, you must stay away from violence, from fear, from terror, and from oppression. And yet that's what we bring into our homes almost every day on the television. And if we want our children to be in peace, then they need to be shown how can you live in peace. Verse 15 talks about, they will gather together, but not by me. They shall gather together against thee, but they will fall. Do you see that's the Tower of Babel, where people are gathering together to build this tower, but it's going to fall because it's not of God. Anyway, all of this is an interesting commentary. So take the time and read Isaiah 54 and 55 with the eye of reading it in the context of Noah and the Tower of Babel. Okay. Now, when it mentions the flood, do I have flood on there? Yes, the very last word here, flood, which is mabal. They're not really sure what the verbal root of flood is. It only has a BL, and then it has the M that makes it a thing. And so they don't know if it comes from BBL or BLL. What is the letter that gets dropped? Or BLH. And so Rashi, who is one of the commentators in the Talmud, says it's all of those words. That the flood comes from Bala, which means to ruin everything. It comes from Balal, B-L-L, which is the basis of Babylon. Everything is confused. How the language gets confused. And Yud, B-L, which means to bring high things low. And I don't know about you, but you can just see the whole flood and Tower of Babel story and why it's called Babel and why it's Babylon, and that is a confusion of tongues and everything is ruined. This is what's coming as a result of the choices that the people are making. Okay, we looked at Hamas. Then next is the ark. God is going to give him a pattern. This is one of the two things where God tells you how to build it. Now, in the Book of Mormon, we get a repeat of this story, right? Because Nephi is going to be given the pattern on a mountaintop of how to build a boat, which will save his family. I hope you see that as a Noah story, okay? But the word ark is teba, and this is only used in 2 places. It is not the word for the Ark of the Covenant. Lots of people will compare these two and say, oh, the Noah's Ark is a wooden box, just like the Ark of the Covenant. Well, it is, but it's not the same word. It is in English, but it's not in Hebrew. So the only 2 things called a teba are Noah's Ark and the basket, which is covered in pitch inside and out, that Moses, the baby, is placed in and set in the waters. So Noah and Moses have this same story in common, of being taken out of the waters and saved. Okay? Pulling Pharaoh and what's going on among the children of Israel as they are slaves into the story of Noah and the ark, and who is righteous and who's wicked. Now the boat, the teba, is built out of gopher wood, and the Hebrew for that is gopher. This is an untranslated word. There is nothing called gopher wood. But the commentaries will say it's probably built of cypress or maybe cedar, although cedar has a different name. Cypress is a deciduous tree that can grow in flooded areas. I don't know if any of you have ever seen cypress growing in a swamp. It has knees, which are the roots of the cypress that come up above the water. Where my daughter lives in the woodlands in Texas, there's cypress everywhere growing in the standing water that's everywhere. And so you see those cypress knees. So I'm thinking it probably was cypress just because it's a tree that grows in water and is preserved by the oils in the wood, and it doesn't rot when it gets wet. It's great in the water. But it also is aromatic, like cedar. It isn't quite as strong as cedar, but it can be used in the same way to keep insects out. So cedar is the wood that is used to line the temple. And that's the other thing that God gives the pattern for how you're to build it. So here we have 2 boxes, one built of cypress and one built of cedar, and there is safety inside them. Moth and rust do not corrupt inside those buildings. Okay? So the ark, with its 3 floors, is similar to the temple with its 3 areas, the tabernacle with 3 areas, and the temple with the 3 levels, because you go up some stairs from the court of sacrifice, the telestial. You go upstairs into the terrestrial room, the garden room, where there is an altar of prayer, and then you go upstairs again to get into the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple and in Ezekiel's temple, the 3rd temple described in the book of Ezekiel.
And in the Salt Lake Temple.
And, of course, in the Salt Lake Temple and in the Columbus, Ohio Temple. They only go up about this high. It's just a little ramp, but they make sure that you go up. To go up is Allah. Well, it's not on the board yet because it's later. That's the word for leaves, but it also means to go up because leaves grow upward toward the sun. And that becomes the word for the Holocaust offering as the offering goes up to God. That'll be at the end of the story of Noah, where this wonderful smell rises up to God. And that is the Olah, the Holocaust offering. Now that's the word you're going to see in Genesis 22, where God says to Abraham, bring your son Isaac and offer him up to me. Well, there's different ways you can offer things up. One is a Holocaust, burn it up, and another is the heave offering, where you just raise something up to God. It's a little ambiguous. So we have this boat, but it needs to be pitched. Now, pitch, of course, is tar, but they aren't using, we don't know whether they were using bitumen, which is tar, or not, but whatever they're using to pitch that boat, to keep the water out, is called kafar. Folks, that's Kippur. Atone. It's the atonement that makes that boat safe, that keeps the chaotic floodwaters of the deep, which is at the beginning of the Genesis 1 story, the chaos. It keeps it out. Inside there's order. There's 3 levels. Everybody knows their place. You have ordinances. You are ordained. Order, 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 order. That's Alma chapter 14. You want to go and read chapter 13? 13. I mean, you can find it. It says order about, I don't know, 7, 10 times in talking about priesthood. So, where there is no order, that's the flood. That's chaos. That's the deep, Tihom. So, interesting that this temple word, kafar, which means to make reconciliation, to cover. The kipporet is the word, a thing that covers. That's the name of the top of the box, the Ark of the Covenant, upon which the 2 angels, cherubim, sit. That's the kipporet, or the mercy seat. So, this is the only place that I can find in the Old Testament where kafar means something other than temple atonement, which immediately pulls the whole temple and atonement into the story of Noah, which is not surprising, okay? We're going to hopefully get to that. Verse 16, as Noah is building this ark, God tells him, a window thou shalt put in the ark, in verse 16. You'll notice there's a footnote there. That's because this is not the Hebrew word for window. The word for window is chalon, and we'll see that later when Noah opens a window and lets out a dove and lets out a raven. This is not chalon, this is zohar. And as you read in your footnote for 6:16, zohar means a shining thing. There is a tradition that there was a stone, a shining stone, given to Noah to light the inside of the ark, because it doesn't have open windows to bring in daylight. That would let water come in. They're very much like the ark is very much like the barges of the Jaredites, which is, of course, chapter 11, right? Immediately after the story of Noah is the Tower of Babel, and there's the Jaredites. So the idea is that Noah had this stone on the ark, and the Zohar, this is from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, which I'm going to, did any of you ever buy a copy of the Encyclopedia of Mormonism? It's 4 volumes. At one point, I was the public affairs director for our stake, and someone who had money in Salt Lake, probably, had donated a whole bunch of money to the church and said, we want books in every public library. And so they had a set of books that had been donated that I was to take to every public library in northeastern Ohio and donate them. Some libraries would accept them, some would not. But the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, 4 volumes, was part of that donation. And one library accepted it and then said, oh, we don't want these 4. They kept the others, but they didn't want the 4. And so I called up and said, what should I do with these? And they said, just keep them. So I have the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, and it's also available free online. Just type in Encyclopedia of Mormonism, and you can read all 4 volumes by yourself. It's awesome. I'm sure someone wishes they could change the name now, but oh well, that's what it is. This is, stones were made to shine by the touch of God's finger to light the barges. It's talking about the Jaredites. Shining stones are not unique to the Book of Ether. Another reference is the shining stone in Noah's Ark. The Jerusalem Talmud says that the stone in the ark shone brighter in the night than in the day, so that Noah could distinguish the different times of day. Shining stones are mentioned several times in the Pseudepigrapha. So it's like, do you remember how the brother of Jared goes up on the mountaintop and God gives him the pattern for how to build the boats? But when he says there's no light in them and there's no air, God gives him a pattern for how to get air in the boat, and he doesn't say a thing about lights. Why not? Because Jared should be able to get that himself from the scriptures. That, you need shining stones. That's how Noah had light. A Zohar, it's going to show up lots of times in the Old Testament, but translated as noonday. This is not a little glow. This is the sun at noon. Lots of power, lots of light coming from this stone. And so I think that's why the brother of Jared knew he could get 16 stones, one at each end of his barge, and later we'll hear that the 2 of his stones will be made into a Urim and Thummim, which are found with the Book of Ether in the Book of Mormon. And Mosiah will use that which he has to translate. He is a seer because he has these stones. Okay, all of this comes out of the story of Noah and the ark. Did I finish that page? Yeah. Okay. Okay, that takes us to 6:17. Behold, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth. Now, it's interesting that it's a flood of waters because Latter-day Prophets will talk about different kinds of flood. We're going to flood the earth with the Book of Mormon. We're going to flood not with chaos, but with order. And as we establish stakes of Zion, it's increasing order in the land. I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. Now, that's obviously referring back to the creation of Adam, right? And God breathes into him the breath of life. But it continues, from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee I will establish my covenant. And thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. And of every living thing, they're going to come into this ark. Now, every living thing, it's going to say, I think it's 4 times, are going to be part of the covenant. Everything in which there is the breath of life are part of this covenant that God gives to Noah. Now, one of the problems that we have is if God has a covenant with the animals, who also have the breath of life in them, everything wherein there is the breath of life, we often interpret that breath of life, breath being ruach, which means breath or wind. That was the wind passing over the deep, the Tehom, the flood, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Or spirit. So the Holy Spirit is the Ruach Kadosh. Do animals have spirits? And it's like the scriptures are kind of ambiguous on that subject. And so you'll find different opinions. But animals are covered by God's covenant. And thus, the implication is how you treat them is part of your covenantal responsibilities. So I'm going to establish, and we've run out of space on the board. So you can see I'm not even going to get through half. Oh, well, I try. So establish is the first verb used with covenant language. And it's the Hebrew Q-U-M or kum. And that means to establish, to make firm, to secure, to fulfill. So this is not the first time that apparently Noah has been given the covenant, because God is saying, I'm going to fulfill my covenant with you. So what that says is covenants have been going on and being made, and no mention of them up to this point. But we will get to the covenant language used, which establishes the language for talking about the covenant forever, is in this story of Noah. And it's not new to Noah. We need to recognize that the covenant has been before them. But I think it's important to note in verses 18 and 19, the covenant is only given in the context of you, Noah, and your wife, your sons and their wives, animals and their wives, male and female. That is the beginning of the covenant, is two couples, male and female. First mention of covenant is in that context. Now when it talks about the 7 animals, this is 2. When it talks about the 7, it doesn't say male and female. It says Ish and Ishot, a man and his wives, which is kind of interesting. That's from the Adam and Eve story. Verse 21. Okay, you need to take enough food for everything. Fowls, cattle, creeping things, that's the order of the creation story, and people. You need to take with you food to be eaten. Thou shalt gather it in. It shall be food for you and for them. The word there is ochel, which often gets translated as meat. It is not flesh. This is grain and vegetables. Until after the flood, nobody is eating meat in the Old Testament story. It's only after the flood that God changes that law and says, okay, from now on you can eat the flesh of animals, but not with blood in it. You can't eat the blood. And so the Jews will kosher their meat, which means they pack salt around it and it draws the meat juices out. That gets rid of the blood. So that's the important part of kosher meat, is getting the blood out of it. But every place that you see, and this is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 and 30, where it's talking about the grain and the seeds and the herbs and the fruit trees for food, the word there is this ochel, which gets translated as meat. So you can, just in your head, everywhere you see meat in the Old Testament, think meal. Okay? It's grains or vegetables, herbs. It is not ever meat. Meat is using the word basar, which is flesh. And it'll say flesh. Okay, so so the Noahic laws, I think we have time for this. So before the flood, these are the rules that are handed down to the Gentiles becoming Christians. And this is part of the list. And this list was made up by the Jews and is written down in the Talmud. Number one, you can eat animals, but only if they're dead. Why would you, how could you eat a living animal? Well, there are stories that the rabbis will use of somebody who wanted some beef but didn't want to kill his steer, so he just cut off one leg. Not acceptable. Not acceptable. You have to kill the whole animal. But speaking of killing, you can't kill people. And specifically, not your brother, right? Because of the story of Cain and Abel. You must have courts of justice. Because remember how Cain says, this isn't fair, everybody's going to kill me, so Jehovah puts a mark on him to protect him so nobody else will kill him. He has received mercy in a court of law. And so you have to have a court to make these decisions. There should not be blasphemy, immorality, idolatry, or theft. And they'll notice places where that comes up, particularly in the description of the time of the flood. Other commands, more positive commands that are seen to be in place before the time of Moses are keep the Sabbath day holy. I mean, that was the first story, right? Genesis 1. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Number 2, sacrifice. That's from Cain and Abel, and now we're going to see Noah building an altar and offering sacrifice. Tithes are pre-Mosaic. We'll see that in the story of Abraham and Melchizedek. Levirate marriage, meaning if your brother dies, you have to take care of his wife or his daughters. So Abram takes his brother's Haran's daughter, Sarah, and marries her. That's levirate marriage. The offering up of grains on the altar, because that's what that's what Cain offers, or the offering of the firstborn, which is assumed in the story of Abel, but specifically firstborn, the first one where it mentions firstborn is Abraham and Isaac. So, and clean and unclean animals, which, where did that come from? Right? Noah is told to bring in 7. This is chapter 7. Come thou and all thy house, that's the first time house is used, and that's Beth, which is the same word as daughters. So when we talked about sons of God and daughters of men, daughters is Beth, and plural is betot. Come into the house. I have seen thy righteousness. And of every clean beast thou shalt take thee by 7s, male and female. Of the beasts that are not clean by 2, male and female, of the 7s, and it's strange because it doesn't actually say male and female in the Hebrew, it says ish and isha, wives. And so they go on to the ark. Now, trying to keep track of how many days they're on that boat, because there's two stories woven together, it gets very confusing. Is this the same 40 as the last time they mentioned 40? Is this the same 150 as before when they mentioned 150? Now, the rabbis have done us a favor, and they counted them. And they say it's 277 days that the flood is upon the earth before the mountains can be seen again and the ark comes to rest on the mountain. Now that happens to be the number of days that the rabbis believed it takes from conception to birth of a child.
How many days again?
277. It'll talk about in the 10th month. And so you're getting an image here of the earth being born again. And mountain, which is the first thing that you see, is har, and pregnancy is hara, because a woman becomes mountainous when she is pregnant. But since Har-el, that's not right, Horeb, the mountain of the Father, is one of the names for Moriah. That's not right. Moriah is in Jerusalem. Mount Sinai is also called Horeb, or the mountain of the Father. That's kind of funny because it's not the father that gets pregnant. It's the mother who gets pregnant, but that's the name for the mountain, which is the mountain of the Lord. Okay, so we have this imagery of the earth being born again. Okay, I skipped over 7:3. Of fowls of the air by sevens, male and female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. You just have two of the important words of the covenant: land and seed. So God doesn't need to move the land in order to save the land. It's there under the flood, and when the flood goes away, you'll see the land again. But we need to preserve the seed during this pregnancy. Okay? So land and seed. Now, we're just going to jump. I just want you to see this one word. This is Genesis 9, verse 9, speaking of covenant language. I will establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you. And verse 12, this is the token of the covenant between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations, for generations forever. Now down to verse 16. The bow will be in the cloud, I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. So Noah's story is where we get this language of everlasting covenant. The Jews use this phrase as well, and it is called the Brit Olam. That's from Berit, which is covenant, and Olam, A-L-M, which gets translated here as everlasting. But Olam is also the world, the solar system, the universe, everything there is all under covenant. That's the imagery of covenant language. And man is the only thing, the only creation, that ever breaks the covenant. The earth doesn't disobey the laws of physics. The moon isn't going to fall into us, regardless of what the movies say. Everything is held in place, as the book of Abraham will describe. There's things that one is higher than another and they influence each other, and it's talking about gravity and astronomy there. It's wonderful. All of that is covered by covenant language. And all of it is involved in this rebirth. Now, we'll often speak of, and especially right now, because we're starting to talk about Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant. You know, shouldn't really call it that, because it's God's covenant. He's the one who made the covenant and offered it to us. And it has been around forever. That's Olam. It doesn't start with Noah. It doesn't start with Abraham. They're invited into it. But this covenant, if you will keep my commandments, you'll prosper in the land. I will give you land and seed. You will have children as numerous as the sands of the seashore. But if you are wicked, you will be cut off. That's the language of covenant. And we'll see that as we continue with Noah next week. So remember, it's not the covenant of baptism or the covenant of sacrament or the covenant of Abraham. There's only one covenant, and that's the covenant God offers us. And it is the new and everlasting covenant. And each of the others are descriptions of rituals or pieces within it, or when it was offered in a particular way. But the covenant is the whole thing, the everlasting covenant. I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.